The sky was not sky anymore. It was a screaming wound, a whirl of ash and molten glass where the planet Malachor cracked open like the heart of a dying god. The mass shadow generator had fired, and in an instant, all sound, all life, all light was devoured. Among the drifting ruins, a soldier awoke. His armor was seared, his lungs filled with dust, and his mind echoed with a chorus of the dead. Every breath was agony. Every heartbeat a reminder that he alone had survived the impossible. But in that silence, in the vacuum left by a billion extinguished souls, something whispered. A hunger. It was not the will to live. It was the need to consume, to fill the hollow echo now pulsing inside him. And as he rose unsteady, the air trembled, and the Force itself recoiled. Darth Nihilus had been born, though he did not yet know his name. Malachor's silence was eternal. The air was thick with the memory of screams that no longer existed. The man wandered through ruins that pulsed faintly with residual energy, echoes of the mass shadow generator's devastating wave. Sometimes he thought he could hear voices, familiar yet distant, calling his name. But they were only the Force's remnants, the whispers of countless souls absorbed into the soil. Every step seemed to drain him further, yet the hunger within swelled, a hollow ache beneath his ribs, an endless thirst. The Force had touched him, marked him, and where others would have died, he endured. He was the last echo of Malachor, a survivor of a planet that had devoured itself. Nights no longer passed. There was only the dim flicker of lightning and the endless twilight of destruction. The man built a shelter among fallen spires, feeding on moisture from the air, haunted by visions of the war. Each time he slept, he dreamed of stars collapsing, of his voice screaming. And yet the sound never reached him. In waking, he began to sense others. Faint, broken spirits wandering the wasteland. Instinct drew him to them. When he approached, they faded. Their life energy pulled into him. He didn't understand. He only felt sated. The hunger quieted for a moment, and then returned deeper. Days blurred into eternity. The man no longer remembered his name. He spoke to the void, and it whispered back, a language older than the stars. It told him that to survive, he must feed, not on flesh, but on the essence of the living. He obeyed, unknowingly shaping himself into something no longer human. As the Force filled him, he felt his body fading, replaced by shadow. The more he consumed, the less he existed. Hunger became his identity. He was not alive, nor dead, merely echo. When at last he lifted his gaze to the sky, the storm had changed. Above him hung the fractured remnants of warships, frozen in orbit, glinting like dark moons. He felt them, the remnants of battlefields scattered across the galaxy, each one brimming with life for him to consume. A name surfaced in his mind, whispered by the void that now shared his soul. Nihilus. The word echoed, hollow and absolute. He understood its meaning, nothingness. From the silence of Malachor, a new hunger was born, and it would never be satisfied. Malachor slept, but he did not. Days, or perhaps centuries, passed in quiet desolation. The man who had once known pain now felt nothing but the steady pulse of the void within him. It was the heartbeat of hunger, and it called across the stars. He began to hear distant worlds, faint flickers of life glowing against the infinite black. He knew they were alive because he could feel their warmth, and in that warmth he sensed sustenance. Slowly, his body became translucent, his voice a whisper that made stone shiver. His eyes, once filled with terror, now reflected only emptiness. He had become the echo that devoured, echoes. He built from ruin a ship, forged from wreckage and bone, powered by the will of the Force itself. The vessel rose from Malakor's surface, like a phantom breaking from the sea. It became his fortress, his feeding ground. The voice inside him grew stronger, teaching him how to consume entire lives through the void. When he breathed, stars trembled. When he whispered, the Force itself seemed to wither. Nihilus felt no malice. There was no hatred left in him, only the eternal ache to fill the silence that had birthed him. He began to drift through the outer rim, a shadow following the remnants of war. On one nameless planet, he sensed a village, hundreds of heartbeats, a faint collective glow of life. He descended inside. The villagers looked up to the darkened sky and saw nothing. Only the stars dimming one by one. Their voices fell still as their essence drained into him. Nihilus closed his eyes and felt their lives dissolve like sand through his fingers. When he opened them again, only wind remained. The hunger was quiet for a moment. In consuming life, he consumed identity. Memory blurred. Face, voice, and name became shadows. The galaxy whispered rumors of a phantom that could erase whole worlds. Yet Nihilus himself no longer remembered what drove him. He only knew that each feeding left him emptier. The void was never satisfied. The silence grew louder. His humanity, once fragile but real, was now dust within his armor. He was not man nor spirit. He was hunger given shape. One night, if night still had meaning, Nihilus heard a voice that did not beg for mercy. It came from beyond Malakor's pull, calm and ancient. It spoke not in fear but in knowledge. You are not the first to be devoured by the dark, it said. But perhaps you will be the last to master it. The voice was Darth Treya, a woman cloaked in secrets and sorrow. She promised him understanding, and he followed, not from curiosity, but because his hunger recognized its kin. The academy on Malakor was a tomb of secrets. Once filled with the cries of Sith apprentices, it now slumbered beneath layers of dust and shadow. Within its depths stood Darth Treya, her voice a melody of broken truths. She saw in Nihilus not a monster, but a mirror of the galaxy's wound, a wound she herself had helped carve. She taught him that his hunger could be controlled, shaped into a weapon of purpose. Together, they would birth a new order, a triumvirate of shadows, to erase the weakness of the Jedi and the chaos of the Sith. Yet, even as she spoke, Nihilus' silence pressed upon her mind, like deep water, cold and endless. He learned, but not as her student. He absorbed. Treya guided him through visions of the Force, its threads connecting every living thing. But where she saw harmony, Nihilus saw sustenance. He could feel every connection, every pulse of life, and he could taste it. Treya realized too late that she had not taught him balance. She had taught him the anatomy of his next feast. Still, she persisted, whispering lessons of patience, deception, and command. He did not respond with words, only silence, and in that silence she sensed something terrifying. Not disobedience, but inevitability. Soon another joined them, a man of fury and pain whose body refused to die. Darth Sion, the Lord of Pain, drawn by the gravity of Malakor's darkness. The three of them formed the triumvirate, Treya the mind, Sion the flesh, Nihilus the hunger. Together they plotted the death of the Jedi, not through armies or battles, but through despair. Nihilus, silent as ever, stood beside them, his presence eroding even the air. When Treya spoke of destiny, he turned his gaze toward the stars. To him, destiny was another word for consumption. Their unity was short-lived. Power, by its nature, devours itself. Treya's voice, once the thread binding them, began to sound like chains. Sion's rage grew restless, and Nihilus' hunger grew too vast to contain. When Traya spoke of restraint, Nihilus heard starvation. When she spoke of fate, he heard defiance. He no longer listened to her lessons. He drained them, word by word, until her strength waned. She realized, too late, that she had birthed not a student, but a void that could swallow gods. The betrayal came without sound. Nihilus and Sion stood before their master as she spoke of unity one final time. Then, the force twisted. Traya gasped, her own strength torn from her body by the power she had nurtured. Nihilus raised his hand and in a single voiceless command stripped her connection to the Force entirely. The galaxy shuddered as she fell, defeated not by hatred but by the echo of her own teachings. In silence, Nihilus turned away, his hunger deepened, his purpose now unrestrained. The triumvirate was broken. The void had claimed its first throne. From the cold reaches of space, Nihilus drifted like a storm with no beginning and no end. Worlds fell silent in his wake. Yet, among the stars, one world still shimmered, Qatar, home to the Miraluka, the blind seers who saw through the Force. They were pure light, untouched by war. Their presence called to him like the scent of warmth to a starving beast. Nihilus descended upon the planet, cloaked in stillness. When he fed, the light of Qatar was extinguished. Cities vanished into dust. But from the silence, one survivor emerged, a woman who had seen the moment of death, and yet still breathed. Her name was Visas Mar. When Visas awoke, she lay among the ashes of her people. Blind eyes that once saw through the Force now stared into emptiness. And yet, in that void, she perceived him. The one who had taken everything. She should have hated him. But what she felt was sorrow. A resonance. His hunger and her loss were made of the same silence. Nihilus, sensing her faint flicker of life, drew her to him through the darkness. She did not resist. For reasons even he did not understand, he spared her. The Devourer had chosen to keep a witness. Aboard the Ravager, Visas was remade. Nihilus reached into her mind, showing her visions of endless hunger, the galaxies he would consume. She saw his memories, Malakor's ruin, Traya's betrayal, the black well that was his soul. He bound her to him through the Force, not as servant nor prisoner, but as reflection. In her presence, his hunger quieted, if only slightly. She spoke softly to him, her voice trembling yet brave. "You are not void," she whispered. "You are sorrow." He said nothing, but for the first time the silence between them felt less like death. She learned his language, the rhythm of silence, the pulse of the Force that replaced his voice. Through that silence, she came to understand his torment. Every life he consumed filled him only for moments before emptiness returned, deeper each time. He was trapped within his own hunger, devouring to survive, dying in the act of survival. Sometimes she felt his gaze linger upon her, not as prey, but as something distant and forgotten, compassion perhaps. When she spoke to him of peace, the void within him trembled. For a fleeting moment, Nihilus knew quiet. Visas' presence dulled the ache that had devoured galaxies. She called him master, but her tone was one of sorrow, not submission. In her, he glimpsed what he had once been, a man reaching toward the light, before the hunger took him, yet peace could not last. The void does not share. The more she soothed his torment, the more his hunger rebelled. He turned his gaze toward new stars, and Visas felt the tremor of his intent. The Devourer would rise again, and this time, no world would escape his reach. The galaxy trembled. The name Nihilus had become legend, a phantom whispered in fear across systems. Entire worlds were said to vanish when his shadow passed. His ship, the Ravager, drifted through the void like a corpse of war, its presence heralded by silence. On the bridge, he stood unmoving, a specter draped in darkness. His hunger had grown too vast to control. Even Visas could feel it now. a storm that would not rest until the galaxy itself was hollow. Yet behind his mask, there was no rage, no pleasure, only the quiet, endless ache of a soul that could never be filled. Nihilus turned his gaze toward the planet Telos, a world rich with life and renewal. He could feel it, every heartbeat a pulse of warmth calling to his hunger. The Ravager moved silently through hyperspace, drawn as if by instinct. Visas pleaded with him to stop, her voice trembling as she reached out through the Force. "There will be nothing left," she whispered. But the void does not listen. As the ship descended, the air itself began to die. Trees wilted, oceans fell silent, and the very light from the sun seemed to bend away from the world's surface. He raised his hand and the Force screamed. An entire continent shuddered as its life force was torn away. The ocean boiled beneath his will, but as he fed, a fracture split through his being. A surge of power so vast it threatened to consume him as well. Visas fell to her knees, clutching her chest as his hunger rippled through her. For a brief, terrible moment, Nihilus faltered. Somewhere deep inside the endless void, the man he once was, the broken soldier from Malachor, reached upward, gasping for air. Then, just as quickly, he vanished again into the dark. The Ravager shook as the storm of the Force subsided. The crew, remnants of dead soldiers bound by Nihilus' will, stood lifeless at their posts. Visas rose weakly, gazing at her master. "If you continue," she whispered, "there will be no one left to feed upon." Her words trembled through the silence, and for the first time, Nihilus hesitated. Not from pity, but from exhaustion. The hunger had grown heavier than his strength. Even the void was beginning to consume itself. He turned away from her, the mask reflecting the fading light of Telos. His silence for once was not power. It was grief. In the aftermath, Nihilus withdrew to the darkness between stars. He stood at the edge of the galaxy, the last lights of Telos fading behind him. He could still feel Visas' presence, a faint thread of compassion that had survived his storms. But the hunger would not rest. It would never rest. Somewhere far away, the Force itself began to stir. A whisper of resistance. A name carried through the void. The Exile. Nihilus turned toward that sound, as if recognizing something he had lost long ago. The next devouring would not be for survival. It would be for destiny. The Exile felt his presence long before the Ravager appeared in orbit. The stars themselves seemed to recoil, dimming under the weight of his hunger. She stood upon the deck of her ship, the Ebon Hawk, her heart steady, her eyes closed. Where others heard silence, she heard pain. A wound in the Force that had never healed. "Nihilus," she whispered. "The one who cannot be filled." Below, Telos prepared for its final stand. But the Exile did not come to fight a monster. She came to confront a reflection of what she might have become. Had she never turned back from the void? The Ravager groaned as the Exile's ship docked. Smoke and ash filled the corridors, echoes of dead soldiers haunting the air. Visas walked beside her, silent but resolute. "He is my master," she murmured, "but I would see him freed." The Exile nodded. She could feel Nihilus ahead, not in rage, but in sorrow. The closer they came, the heavier the air became, thick with the scent of burnt ozone and decay. Doors slid open to reveal the vast skeletal chamber where he waited, motionless as if carved from the night itself. He turned his head toward them. No words, no breath, only the trembling of the air as his power swelled. The Exile raised her hand in peace, but the Force surged like a storm. His hunger lunged forward, seeking to drain her, to consume her essence as he had done to thousands before. Yet, as it touched her, something broke, not in her, but in him. The Exile was an absence in the Force, a mirror of his own emptiness. When his hunger met her void, it reflected endlessly, feeding upon itself. The Ravager shook as reality folded under their connection. The duel was not fought with blades, but with memory. Pain against compassion, hunger against forgiveness. Nihilus' power surged, consuming everything it touched. Yet the exile did not fall. She stepped closer through the torrent, her presence calm and steady, her voice breaking the silence. "You are not hunger," she whispered. "You are grief." For the first time, Nihilus' mask tilted downward, as if the word itself had struck him. He hesitated. In that instant, the darkness faltered, and the force, long denied, began to flow again through the void he had become. Silence returned. Nihilus fell to one knee, the power that once sustained him dissolving into light and dust. His mask slipped from his face, revealing not a monster, but the faint outline of a man, hollow-eyed and sorrowful, fading like mist at dawn. The exile knelt before him, resting her hand on his shoulder. "Rest," she said. She said, "The galaxy remembers." For the first time in uncounted years, the hunger was gone. Nihilus looked upon her, his gaze empty yet peaceful. And then, he was no more. Only his mask remained, rolling gently across the floor until it came to rest in the stillness. The battle was over. The Ravager drifted in silence above Telos, its engines dead, its structure collapsing under the weight of centuries of decay. The exile and Visas stood together amid the fading light. The void that had once consumed stars now felt empty in a different way, not hungry, but peaceful. Nihilus was gone, yet his presence lingered like the scent of rain after a storm. The exile closed her eyes and listened. For the first time in years, the force was quiet, not empty, just quiet. Visas knelt and lifted the fallen mask of her master. Its surface was smooth, pale, almost human. She could still feel traces of him. A faint warmth, a whisper. "He is gone," she said softly. The exile placed a hand upon hers. "He was never truly here," she replied. They carried the mask to the viewport and set it upon the console, letting the light of Telos wash over it. The sun rose on the planet below, golden and fragile, painting the dark metal in hues of dawn. The galaxy breathed again. As the Ravager descended toward Telos' atmosphere, its hull breaking apart, the exile guided it through the force. Gentle, steady, like guiding a dying animal home. Flames streaked across the sky as fragments of the ship fell into the ocean, hissing softly upon impact. On the surface, the people of Telos looked upward, witnessing the fall of the vessel that had once brought death, now returning as light. The sea accepted the wreckage, and silence followed, deep and eternal. In the days that followed, Visas wandered the plains of Telos, guided by the Force once more. Where Nihilus had brought desolation, new life began to bloom. The air was cool, the soil rich, the silence gentle instead of suffocating. She carried his mask with her, not as a relic of terror, but as remembrance of sorrow, of fall, of redemption unspoken. When the wind passed through the canyons, it carried a soft hum, a note so low it was almost silence. Visas smiled. The void had found its peace, far beyond the living worlds. In the quiet places between stars, a mask drifts slowly through space. No sound, no breath, no motion, only the faint shimmer of light across its surface. Once, it was the face of hunger. Now, it is memory. The echo of a man who sought to fill his emptiness and in doing so, taught the galaxy the price of forgetting the self. The mask turns gently, catching the starlight, and for a fleeting instant, the galaxy seems to sigh. Darkness, at last, has fallen asleep.